Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are comparing two very interesting kinds of pre-modern cavalry, the Cataphracts and the medieval knight. Now what's interesting to say about these two kinds of warriors is that yes, they are both mounted warriors clad in metal armor, using lances. But that doesn't mean that they are similar. In fact, they are quite dissimilar. There are a lot of things that are different, and we will be examining all of these points on this video. So first and foremost, to give you a little bit the structure of this video, we're going to discuss three things that have to do with the Cataphracts and the medieval knights. First and foremost, their role in society. What did it mean to be a Cataphract and what did it mean to be a medieval knight? Secondly, we're going to examine their weapons and armor, and there is a lot of variation, not only within the medieval knight, because of course the Middle Ages were a very big period of time, but also when saying Cataphracts, the amount of variation in weapons, armor, is astonishing. Also within the metals used, you will see. Thirdly, we are going to discuss about the tactical applications of these kinds of warriors. However, before we can dive into these three sections of this video, I'd like to make a little bit of a preamble and introduction, which will be very interesting, so bear with me. But we do need to understand the origins of cavalry, the relation between the animal, the horse, and men from prehistorical times all the way to classical times, before we can understand the differences, the evolutionary differences between a classical mounted warrior and a late medieval one. Because of course the moment you say cavalry, the first thing that comes to your mind is the image of the medieval knight, the mounted nobility, aristocracy clad in steel armor, riding their steeds, charging against their enemy. But the thing is that cavalry as a concept was not concocted in medieval times. It was excogitated a long time before the Middle Ages, and it will continue to be used all the way up to even relatively recently. So we can say that cavalry as a concept linked to military warfare strides across the centuries. Our tale begins in 10,000 BC. We're talking about prehistorical times, prehistorical tribes of hunter-gatherer populations. We're trying to understand now, we are focusing on their role with horses, with the equine. Now the reason why we are focusing on the role of horses at this time is because clearly we don't have neither the time nor the wherewithal to examine every single aspect of that time, but it is sufficient to understand the development of cavalry. At this time, the role of horses was one, simple. It was food. It is astonishing, astounding, the amount of evidence, archaeological evidence, that demonstrates the fact that horses were hunted down a lot by hunter-gatherer populations. So this might sound strange, bizarre, odd. Now the reason is quite simple, because of the herd-like nature of horses. Basically, the fact that they graze all together made it a lot easier for hunter-gatherer populations to hunt them down and kill them. Things start to change dramatically in 2400, 2300 BC, so we are in the early Akkadian period. This is when we see the first evidence, pictorial evidence, of actual mounting of horses. But what's interesting is that at this time, no reins, no saddle, and the rider of these horses was most of the time using his legs to grab, to be gripped onto the animal, and it was very close to the animal as he was riding. So at this time, horseback riding is used mostly for two reasons. Reason number one, speed. Reason number two, messages. So no warfare at the moment. Also, not all is evidence that we have from this time is definitive evidence, because sometimes it's not easy to distinguish because of the techniques used, very rudimental. It's not easy to distinguish a horse from, for example, a onager. We can tell them apart, the two animals, very different animals, because of the length of the tail, the overall size of the animal, and of course the mane. Early humans tried to adapt to the same controls that were used for donkeys, and also packed animals for horses, and they didn't really work, because of course a packed animal is slow, but a horse in speed needs a completely different kind of reins. Now we know that, and reins will be developed, but it is important to underline before we talk about mounted combat that reins first were also introduced into a different kind of unit, which is the chariot. You do have horses involved, but the rider is not riding the horse, is riding the chariot and using the reins to govern and control the animal. We need to wait until 1000 BC before we can start seeing armored mounted warriors, so warriors on horse. But the early kinds of mounted warriors weren't similar to cataphracts and weren't similar to medieval cavalry. They were mounted archers. So the very beginning in the steppe of Eurasia, the very beginning of mounted combat has to do with bow and arrow. And the reason is quite simple. There are two reasons. Reason number one is that mounted archers were excellent to outflank slower infantry, because we do need to remember that at this time, whenever we go into classical antiquity, we need to understand that infantry is the main core. But as we move into late antiquity, the Romans themselves will start to use cataphracts, and we will get back to that in a moment. So the Romans did use cavalry, but it was a very different way. So early classical antiquity had a different approach to mounted warfare than medieval times and even late antiquity, and that is because one of the things that Romans and Greeks understood, horses could not be made to charge a stationary line. It was very difficult. They didn't know how to train horses properly, whereas medieval war horses were very well trained, but also infantry was very disciplined at this time, and it is not easy to charge with cavalry a cohesive and very highly disciplined heavy infantry unit. Such a thing would be difficult also for medieval knights, but medieval knights were more trained. Their steeds were bigger, quite bigger than classical horses and the sort of breeds that they had, and also no medieval army ever reached the same level of professionalism as, for example, the Roman army and the sort of discipline that Roman armies had. So the way cavalry was used mostly in antiquity, in classical antiquity, was for three things: scouting, skirmishing, and pursuing enemies that were running away. Okay, so let's begin with the first section. What's the difference between being a cataphract and being a medieval knight in terms of social structure? Now, this is already a big difference, because first and foremost, we need to say one thing about medieval knights. Yes, the majority of people understand what a medieval knight is, meaning, as I said, mounted nobility, aristocracy, a man who had to do both with military and politics of the time, a man who was knighted, so a noble. But what's interesting to say, what's important to say, is that not every warrior in full plate armor riding a horse in the Middle Ages was a knight. Oftentimes they are men-at-arms, so they are not knighted, and yet they fight in the manner of a knight. They train like knights, and sometimes they even make as much money as the knights did, so in terms of wages. Some of these were gentlemen, they perhaps even started as common soldiers and started raising up. Some men-at-arms could be armigers or esquires, and some men-at-arms, although they were not strictly speaking knights, they would participate into jousts. So when we say knights, we're talking about mounted nobility. So were you a noble if you were a cataphract? And the answer is, it depends. When talking cataphracts, we are talking about a kind of heavy armored cavalryman that was used by a whole range of different populations and a whole range of different civilizations, including but not limited to the Romans, the Parthians, the Sassanid Empire, and the Seleucid Empire. Now, being a cataphract in any of these civilizations had completely different social repercussions. So when talking Romans, for instance, the cataphracts unit were adopted quite late, and the only reason why they adopted them is because when they were facing other empires, such as the Sassanid Empire or the Parthians, that were using the cataphract with effective results, then we know how the Romans were. They were adaptable, they were fluid. The Roman machina, the war machina of the Romans was adaptable. We know that. Whenever they needed to change, they changed. But even when they started adopting heavy cavalry, so cataphracts, still they were auxiliary. Okay, so they were not elite troops, and that is a massive difference with medieval knights already. They were recruited locally. This way, a Roman general or a Roman commander could just raise a full corps of Cataphracts from wherever it was locally, and therefore ethnicity would also change. Now this is greatly different from the Parthians and the Sassanid Empire, because for the Parthians we don't know much, unfortunately, and most of what we know comes from Greek and Roman literature, for example Plutarch. But we do know that although it is impossible to identify a specific ethnicity linked to the Cataphracts core, we do understand that they did enjoy somewhat elite status within the army. But most importantly, as we move to the Sassanid Empire, then we have a completely different kettle of fish, because for the Sassanid, a Cataphract, not only he was upper class, a member of an elite corps, an elite troop, but upper nobility. Okay, so now let's start examining the differences in equipment, and we will begin from the armor. So of course, as we look at a cataphract, the image of a cataphract and the image of a medieval knight, some differences become apparent immediately, particularly if we have a look and if we compare the cataphracts with late medieval knights. And clearly, if we go past the date 1485 and then we reach the 16th century, we will see that there is a massive gap in technology, because at that time we have the zenith of the construction of plate armor. But if we look at a high medieval knight and compare it with a cataphract, then the difference might seem less obvious, and clearly both would be wearing mail as far as the rider is concerned, and the helmet clearly in the High Middle Ages. As we move from the Norman knight into the more typical and archetypal medieval knight, we see the usage of the great helm. But at first glance they might seem very similar, and yet they are not. One of the key differences is the metal used, because yes, they are all warriors clad in metal, but what metal? And first and foremost, we have to understand that as we reach the Middle Ages, the predominant metal used for the production of armor, particularly quality armor, is steel. Now, of course, there are some exceptions where you do find in some specific context of jousting, and you will find wrought iron, for example, but those are very minimal if compared to other kinds of armor. So steel is the norm, and it's good quality steel. And as we move forward into the late Middle Ages, then steel starts to be heat-treated, and it will be tempered, it will become extremely hard. Now, if we look at the Iron Age, although it's called Iron Age, this might sound a little strange, but steel was already produced. Is that it wasn't the same quality of steel used in the Middle Ages, and of course it would have been rather expensive, and it would be closer to what today we call mild steel, so low carbon steel. But in the case of the cataphracts, again, as we said before, there are many cultures, many empires, and therefore much will depend on the availability, the personal wealth of every single soldier, and the country that we are talking about. So generally speaking, a cataphract would use any metal that he would have available. So sometimes it could be iron, sometimes it could be a copper alloy, and other times it could be bronze. Okay, now we understand the materials in question. What about the sort of armor the cataphracts used? Well, in terms of the type of armor that they used, we've got three possibilities according to iconography. We have mail armor for the rider, we have scale armor for the rider, and we've got lamellar armor. Now, when we talk about the horse, of course, we've got barding. Now, this is one of the main characteristics of the cataphracts. Yes, they are heavy cavalry, but they are very heavy cavalry. And in the majority of cases, although there are some exceptions, the horse would have scale armor, which again could be made of bronze, could be made of iron, or even half and half sometimes. Now, this is a big difference with medieval cavalry, because yes, barding existed in the Middle Ages as well, but it was a lot less common. And the reason for that is because medieval cavalry, from a tactical standpoint, it's a very quick, very fast sort of troop, sort of elite corps, whereas the cavalry that we have in classical period, it did not utilize shock tactics the same way as medieval cavalry did, and we will talk about this later. But in this case, we need to remember that it was a lot slower. So if we had to imagine a clash between the cataphracts and medieval knights, the cataphracts would be quite slower. Important to say as well is that the cataphracts did not invent barding. They did not invent the idea of armoring up horses. This is something that we know has been around at least since 2400 BC in Mesopotamia. For the weapons, the situation becomes very interesting, because Swords were not really something that they used, at least if we have to believe iconography and we have to believe statues and representations. Swords are basically completely absent in any representation of a cataphract in any country. There are only a very limited amount of exceptions. For example, there is a statue that shows just a scabbard, so this could give you an idea of perhaps he lost a sword in battle, but in the majority of cases, no swords. Sometimes we see that only some cataphracts have got quivers, suggesting the idea of the fact that they might be using bows as well. But in the majority of cases and in all accounts, mounted archery is light cavalry that is used separately from cataphracts. So it is possible that since it is just a very occasional representation that we see a cataphract with a quiver, whereas the majority doesn't have any, then it is possible that again it is just social status. Perhaps some officers could also use a bow, but in the majority of cases, again, not a weapon you would imagine cataphracts using. A third possibility is a mace. The remains of a mace with a metal head was found in an area which we know had to do with cataphracts, but we don't know if this mace actually belonged to a cataphract. So the only weapon that we know for sure cataphracts used are lances, and there are quite a lot of possibilities, and again a lot of variation both in terms of length, shape and the way it was used. Sometimes the cataphracts used a lance two-handed, other times they use it one-handed in comparison with a shield. Now what's really different is the tactics, it's the way cataphracts were used as compared to medieval cavalry, and why, in my opinion, the cataphracts should be considered to be the precursor of a much more advanced way of utilizing horses in combat, the medieval knight. The medieval knight is the evolution of cataphracts, no questions asked. The reason for that is because there are three main major differences in the usage of the lance and the concept of cavalry and charge if we look at cataphracts and medieval knights. First and foremost, the saddle. The saddle is improved enormously in the Middle Ages. It becomes a fighting station, it becomes much more solid, and it is a lot harder to unmount a medieval knight than it would be to unmount a cataphract. Stirrups. Stirrups were not used in the times of the cataphracts, so again, stirrups will give a massive advantage to a medieval knight. He will be firm and he will be able therefore to use longer lances, and again the impact will not be a problem for the rider. Third is the technique of putting the lance underneath the armpit of the knight. This is again a medieval technique. We know instead that most of the times the cataphracts used the lance in two ways, either with a low grip and sometimes even fixing it to the horse, and which was considered to be good against infantry, or with a higher grip, which would be similar, a bit more similar to what the medieval knights did, meaning that the lance would be held on the left side of the head of the horse in order to try and attack another rider, so cavalry versus cavalry, but the lance was not used underneath the armpit. That's again a medieval technique which provided shock absorption, and it will be even developed even further in the late Middle Ages when we have plate armor, because on breastplates you have the addition and the invention of the lance rest, which was a section of metal protruding from the breastplate where the lance could be rested, which again provided much more shock absorption and made the impact a lot more secure and stronger. So the techniques are different. Yes, the cataphracts were still an improved version of classical cavalry, because being so armored it would have been a lot harder to kill them. The bigger medieval horse with better techniques, better saddles, better controls and much improved weaponry is definitely the next evolutionary step in the usage of cavalry. Okay, noble ones, well I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. If you like this VS series, I will now put some clickable links to other videos of this very series. There are many other you can find, and you will also find these links in the description below. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.